Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's all gotta start somewhere. In 1992, the Primarch progenitor of all first-person shooters was released, Wolfenstein 3D. And in 1993, I, the Mighty General, was first introduced to video games by my grandfather. My grandfather was not a fan of what he called the stupid pizza man, the Super Mario, and so he decided to introduce me into games by showing me Wolfenstein 3D. And for over 30 years, I, the Mighty General, have been playing video games, and for more than 30 years, the first-person shooter has been going strong. So today, we're going back to the first practical first-person shooter, and my first game, Wolfenstein 3D.
Wolfenstein 3D was developed by the legendary id Software and published by Apogee in the far-off days of May 5th, 1992. I only have the vaguest memories of playing this game shortly before Doom's release. I have no clue how far I got back then, as I was 4 after all, but it most assuredly left an impression. What you're looking at here is the DOS version of the game, and this is what I would have played back in 93. It might look simple today, but man, in those days, it was the future given form. No other game at this time did what Wolfenstein 3D was able to do. Oh sure, there had been other first-person shooters prior to this, but none felt as smooth and as responsive as Wolfenstein 3D. A note on the pronunciation. You see, back in the old days, we called it Wolfenstein, not Stein, and to spare your ears, I will continue with the proper pronunciation. Wolfenstein 3D is a first-person shooter, and it's amazing that the first practical first-person shooter has aged as well as it has. Stop me if you heard it before. You play as BJ Blazkowicz. You have escaped from your German captors and have to take on the entire Third Reich yourself. Can you be a bad enough Texan to shoot all the SS men, collect all the keys, and eat all the dog food? Or, if you're super low on health, go Hannibal the Cannibal and drink the blood? First-person shooting hasn't changed much since then. Turns out some things ain't broke and thus they don't need to be fixed. Just evolve those things and make it a little bit better each time. What really makes this game stand the test of time is how quick it is. First-person games back then were slow and pretty cumbersome, but as the old Blazkowicz, you just fly around the levels, and while many PC games in those days were complex to a fault, it's literally as straightforward as the other id Software games. I get it, doesn't seem special, but it's all gotta start somewhere, and this was off to an amazing bloody start. Weapons for the game were okay. We didn't get a shotgun, but we did get a butcher knife, a pistol, a submachine gun, and a gun of many barrels. I loved the submachine gun and the chain gun so much that me and my grandfather made wooden replicas of them back when I was a kid. The ammo is shared between the three, so that means that the gun of many barrels is 9mm. Seems legit, and that's the only way you could carry something like that. The enemies you face are remarkably varied for those days. You have the basic SS Guard, the Big Blue Smurf, German Shepherds, SS Officers, and later you fight Addy the Matty as a boss. So what's the catch? What's this game's fatal flaw? It's over 30 bloody years old, surely it cannot be that great, right? Sadly, the issue with the simulated raycasting engine that this game uses is that it can only render out 90-degree walls, and this means that the levels you are seeing here are pretty much your entire lot. The game is divided into floors, and it feels like each level is the floor of a building or military base, but since that's all you have, the game gets dull before too long, because each level is going to just be another floor, and then another one, and another one. And in those days, you got a bunch of floors if you bought the full registered release of the game. In 92 and for years afterward, it was not that big a deal, as this and Doom and the later id Software games were among the best of the best of the best, sir, in terms of first-person shooting gameplay. But this rather simplistic and repetitive gameplay that we see here gets really dull by about the 30-minute mark. When we review Doom, we will see just how much variety matters when it comes to levels, weapons, and enemies. In Wolf 3D, the enemies get boring and frustrating. Yeah, you can save whenever you want, and you better do that all the bloody time too, because if you don't, you go back to the start of the level and you have no weapons but the pistol. The enemies take a few hits to bring down, and they hurt, and health in later levels will be scarce. The damage system is such that the closer the enemy to you, the more damage he will do, and since you are CQB the entire game, it's hard to keep them at a distance. The controls, while responsive, are still turret controls, meaning you might die before you turn around to blast a bastard. So with all that in mind, you got a small number of weapons that are not one-hit kills, even on the weakest of enemies. You got an endless number of doors you gotta open, and a limited enemy pool all combines to make this game a chore to finish. And I think I might have sent Addy the Maddie straight to hell twice. Once in the 90s and once in the 2010s. Wolfenstein 3D is not a bad game by any means, but id Software had to work with what they had at the time, and they turned out something absolutely revolutionary, and it's only with the march of years that the flaws truly become apparent. Still, I kinda gotta recommend this game to new players, as it's dirt bloody cheap and super bloody fun for about 20 to 30 minutes. But that will be a 20 to 30 minutes well spent, as you will have the experience of going back to the days when the first-person shooter was a revolutionary concept. Despite this game being from 1992, the graphics have aged remarkably well, and that's because this is a 2.5D first-person shooter. 3D models don't really stand the test of time, but 2D does. With this in mind, however, it's still kind of a pixelated mess, but I'm not exaggerating when I say that this game was nothing short of jaw-dropping in 1992, and it still looked pretty bloody good in 1993. Stuff looked like things, even if some of the things were wrong. The guns looked nothing like real German guns. The machine gun, my favorite gun in the game by the way, does not look like an MP40 at all. Instead, it looks like an unholy amalgamation of MAT 49 and Sten gun? Sacre bleu! Funny enough, as a young child, I wrote a Goosebumps fanfic where I blasted a villain from the 90s tactics show with what I called the 99 round machine gun. Because, you see, in Wolfenstein 3D, the game couldn't give you 100 rounds. The enemies are well detailed for 92, and they have some decent animations for the time as well. The levels have great set dressing, and it does look like you are fighting through a German base, to a certain extent. In order to get this game running on the PCs of the day, id chose to leave the floors and ceilings untextured, and this can kinda contribute to getting burnt out when playing the game for long sessions, as the levels can, despite their relative graphical complexity, get monotonous. Wolfenstein 3D would become very, very popular, even though Doom would later overshadow it. Despite it being overshadowed by Doom, it would get ported to a bunch of different systems, including the Super Nintendo, and unlike with the Doom port, the Super Nintendo port was nothing short of excellent. It runs on the stock Super Nintendo. No fancy chips, no FX coprocessor, just pure Nintendo goodness. The Super Nintendo version of Wolfenstein is fun in and of itself to play, even when compared to the DOS version, and in many respects, it's much more impressive than the DOS version. When I was getting this footage, I got sucked into the bloody game and kept coming back to it day after day. While the screen resolution is low and there is some slowdown, I gotta say that as of 2023, this is my favorite version of the game. The levels are shorter, meaning they don't outstay their welcome, and the controls are a little more fluid than the old tank controls, and the whole game just has a much faster pace than the DOS version, and you don't just get bogged down in endless floors. In addition to that, the Super Nintendo version updates Wolfenstein. You get new weapon sprites, you get more weapons, and an auto map. Not that you're really going to need it. The only reason one might complain about this version of Wolfenstein is that it's censored, because Nintendo, Addy the Maddie is gone, as is all the Nazi iconography, and there's no blood, and the dogs were replaced with giant rats, and the enemy sprites are always facing the player. But these are all a very small price to pay for an awesome Wolfenstein experience. If you want to get into Wolfenstein 3D, the Super Nintendo version is a good place to start. Now, if you don't want to go blind by playing this version of the game on RetroArch, you can download EC Wolf. It's the source port for Wolfenstein 3D, and you can download a total conversion for Wolf 3D that turns it into the Super Nintendo version. In that version, you get a much higher frame rate and screen resolution, and you can use a standard controller. It's not a one-to-one conversion, as it does not have the auto map and a few icons are different. All told though, this is my personal favorite Wolfenstein 3D experience. Check the links in the description to check out the mod and the source port. Sound design for the DOS version of Wolfenstein 3D is pretty bloody amazing. Although, funny enough, I hated it. So, in those days, not all PCs had sound hardware. That was an option, and if you didn't have a sound card, you had to use the PC speaker, and you got bleeps and bloops instead of legit digitized sound. And you also didn't get music. When I first first played the game, I used the PC speaker, and it wouldn't be until many years later that I played it with proper sound, and for some reason I thought the old sounds were cooler, but anyway. The guns sound great, the enemies have speech, and thanks to a fan, I now know that the SS officers are not saying biatch over and over again, but instead they're saying the much more historically accurate spion, aka spy. I like mine better. Music for the game is pretty good, but none of the tracks stand out all that much. Still better than Quake, because at least you can hear it. Wolfenstein 3D had a lot of fun details to be found throughout the game. You had the neat difficulty selection that id would use throughout the 90s, you had a few bits of humor, such as the game telling you to get psyched at the start of a level, or calling you a wuss if you tried to quit the game. All these little touches ensured that this game stuck in the memories of all the people who played it back then. The story is pretty basic. You only really get text screens at the end of each episode. In the Super Nintendo version, you get text screens at the beginning and ending of the episodes, and it sets up the plot quite a bit better. The first episode, you have to escape from Castle Wolfenstein. When you do, you see a full body sprite of BJ himself, and he lets out a mighty yeah! The PC speaker sounds like an inarticulate screech, but I like mine better. Episode 2 introduced the zombie Soldaten, and finally Episode 3 is the one where you face down Addy the Matty himself. There are a bunch of other episodes where you face down other Natsocks, and even an expansion pack called Spear of Destiny, but as of 2023, I have yet to play that expansion pack. In 2002, Wolfenstein 3D would receive a sequel called Return to Castle Wolfenstein, and that game would be the first ever game I would play on my own Dell PC. What was really cool about Return to Castle Wolfenstein is that it came with, on disc, a copy of Wolf 3D, and I really loved reconnecting with my early childhood by playing that game. That game is over 20 years old now, and is older than Wolfenstein 3D was when Return to Castle Wolfenstein first came out. Return to Castle would receive a sequel in 2009 called Wolfenstein. That game was criminally overlooked in its day, and it featured a lot of great gameplay and a pretty good story. The Wolfenstein series would continue on with Wolfenstein New Order. This game would be developed by Machine Games, and would feature a much more verbose BJ Blazkowicz, and would feature an alternate history plot where the Nazis ruled the world. The gameplay was pretty bloody awesome. It brought back in health packs and had more than 2 weapons and was absolutely amazing back in those days. And that game is 10 years old almost. That would be followed up by Wolfenstein The New Colossus. This was a much more divisive entry due to its rather, shall we say, controversial story. The gameplay was still pretty bloody fun, poorly written story notwithstanding. And finally, Wolfenstein would feature its worst entry ever, Wolfenstein Youngblood. No longer would you play as the problematic BJ Blazkowicz, instead you would play as his daughters. This game had absolutely abysmal gameplay that was more pay to win than anything else, and a story so heinous that I got the game refunded within an hour. Thankfully, not all has been lost when it comes to Wolfenstein, for you see, as always, the modders pick up the slack. There have been numerous Wolfenstein 3D based mods throughout the years, and the one I recommend taking a look at first is Brutal Wolfenstein. This is a remix of Wolfenstein 3D. Essentially, you've got all that great brutal Doom-styled gameplay, you've got historically accurate weapons, and the levels have been modified and updated to be far less dull. Wolfenstein 3D, ladies and gentlemen, it ain't gonna die any more than Doom is.
Despite its shortcomings, Wolfenstein 3D is still one of my favorite games to this very day. I love the fact that I was able to share all those great 90s gaming memories with my grandfather, and I'm glad that it was he who got me into gaming in the first place. For those wondering, even though he's almost 85, he is still playing games to this very day. I'm General Lotz, wishing you good Duke Nukem 3D, and good Shadow Warrior, or whatever makes you happy.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and please consider leaving a like or a comment, as the algorithm desires your soul. And I want to thank all those fans who have supported this channel, both past and present.